We can start.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Hello to our NalaFem Wednesday webinar. And our conversation today is about how generation equality cannot move forward without Africa. And for anyone who's not familiar with the term, generation equality is a UN Women-convened forum co-hosted by the governments of France and Mexico. And it's aimed at being civil society centered. And as a global gathering for gender equality, however, generation equality is an international forum, and international also includes, Africa with its 54 respective countries. And today I'm delighted to be having a critical conversation with two powerful feminist African powerhouses. I have with me Lusungu Kalanga, who is the host of the podcast Feministin while Malawian, and she's also a gender and development practitioner. And I'm also joined by Joy Zawadi, the Deputy Executive Director of Akinidada, which is an international award-winning leadership incubator, whose vision is to really ensure that African women leaders are actively participating in key decision-making processes across sector. So our conversation today is going to revolve around questions of marginality and tokenization. Sorry, there's an airplane moving through my head. Okay. And our conversation is about marginality and tokenization, but also about the importance of solidarity. We're going to talk about a manifesto that 1,500 young women from across the continent have contributed to. We want to talk about the intersectional demands that African young women have brought. These are really practical solutions that respond back to the current systemic oppressive structures which we have to navigate and resist. And we also want to speak about intergenerational co-leadership. And so just to quickly give you an insight of how the format of this conversation will go, I want us to first get an understanding of the 10 demands. And we will do that by watching a very short video. Then we will go into, we'll move to a discussion with a few questions that I've prepared for Lusungu and Joy. However, we want you to really be parts of this conversation. So do send us your questions in the chat, or if you're watching live on Facebook, drop us comments and questions. We want to engage as much as possible because this is a space for all of us to really share and converse. And please do let us know where you're calling from, because we would love to know that as well. And I would now like to ask my colleague to share the video of the demands, just so that we get an understanding of what exactly we're talking about and what are we asking for as young women. Thank you so much. Thank you for following through the list of the 10 demands. These are demands that you probably relate to. So this is why we're having this conversation, and this is why we're moving forward with the criticality of bringing Africa to the center of generation equality. So without further ado, I would like to start with you, Lusungu. Please tell us about yourself. And I want to talk to you and rewind a little bit back to October 2020, when you took part in the consultations that were joined by other young women from across the continent, which led to the making of the manifesto, to the outlining of these 10 demands. How do you think this manifesto should be mainstream, and what do you think is the role of youth like you and I in amplifying it?
Thank you so much, Amina, and thank you for having me. And I'm thrilled to be here with Joy as well, who I've just met, but I've seen she's also doing such great work on the continent. So briefly, I think you already gave an introduction of me. I'm Lusungu Kalanga from Malawi. I'm a feminist, I'm an activist, I'm a podcaster, I'm a co-founder of an organization called Growing Ambitions, where we provide mentorship to young women, but also I lead the prevention work on violence against women and girls prevention and response program here in Malawi. So yeah, it was actually an honor for me to participate in the consultations for the development of the manifestos, And I thought it was a very inclusive process, and it was really very iterative, where a lot of young women, because I think the assumption that is made a lot of the times is that we're a monolith and very homogeneous, but no, young women have very different needs based on context, based on age group, based on our socioeconomic status, and so many other things. So in terms of mainstreaming it in a normal world, Amina, where where everything was equal, we would not be sitting here to discuss about mainstreaming or even thinking about having the manifesto, because the assumption would be that we are already a priority as young women, but this is not the case. So I do know that there's the Gender Equality Forum, which is a good forum where the manifesto has the potential to be highlighted, right? And to be, to try to push and get commitments. But I feel that there are also so many other non-traditional ways. And if anything, COVID has shown us in terms of using non-traditional ways, in terms of using technology to, mainstream and push for different demands. So already what the NALA Collective is doing, bringing us together to continue discussing this and making sure that we have ownership, right? For those who have access to the internet, for those who have access to TV, for those who have access, to other non-traditional methods like podcasts that I use. All these spaces are spaces where we can push. In terms of, because I know that it's important that it is mainstreamed even at the national level, at the international level, and at the global level, right? So in terms of how we can do it nationally, I know that one way is to push it, or to be in government and make sure that it is being included in as part of policy in the government. But we have seen how hard that has been, and I think we're going to talk about the issue of tokenism. So even for us being outside, we have already managed to build a critical mass that we should not underestimate in terms of pushing to say, listen, we are young women, we are one of the majority, because the continent is a youthful continent. You want us to vote for you. You want us to have you in government, to select you as our leaders. You are telling us to wait for tomorrow, but we don't want to wait for tomorrow. I want to sit on the table when the decisions are made. And I like how this manifesto is framed to say demands. We are not asking, we are not saying, let us discuss. These are things that we are owed by virtue of also being human beings and also participating in the civic life of our country and our continent. So for me, I feel like we will need to be as disruptive as possible in terms of mainstreaming this manifesto, and look to more non-traditional ways than focusing on getting invited to these spaces. And usually when you get invited, then you are turned into, you are quickly put on a pedestal, and all of us are made to, keep quiet, to say, oh, but there is one of us, there's Amina there, there's Joy there. But no, we should stick to it being a collective effort, and all of us have ownership on it, and all of us take the responsibility of mainstreaming it wherever we are. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Lusungu. And I hear you, and it's definitely, and I definitely agree. We want to sit on the table and not be silenced, because you may be given a seat, but you're asked to remain quiet and to, quote unquote, behave. and adhere to the standards that were not, that we didn't take part in putting together. And so, Joy, I want to hear from you as well. Please do introduce yourself. I know you do many, many things, and I would really appreciate it if we could hear from you about this, about young women's inclusion, because young women are told that they're often too young to lead, that their opinions matter. However, if we need to push for young women's participation in key decision-making processes, and young women's experiences and demands need to be taken in consideration and need to be a priority. And I think what I'm asking perhaps here is, what is your view on a practical roadmap to concrete inclusion and something that would go anti-performative supports that we currently see happening?
Thank you, Amina, and thank you for having me on this conversation. It's such a privilege to be here, and I recognize that even as I'm standing here, I'm representing so many others. So just want to acknowledge that. Who am I? I am, my mom calls me an activist, which is something that I never imagined myself as, but by virtue of working with girls and young women and coming from a context that you're constantly bombarded by the challenges that women and girls face. I then leverage the skills that I have and the resources that I am privileged to have to be a storyteller, to amplify girls and young women's voices, and also to actively make sure that I'm resourcing or leveraging the resources that we have access to channel them to girls and young women who are in really need of these opportunities. So in a nutshell, that's who I am. To answer your question on the roadmap, I don't have an answer for the roadmap. I think that there are very many girls, young women who need to be brought into this conversation. So starting there by acknowledging that there's no one specific roadmap. But that being said, I think that there are certain principles or things that we have to acknowledge in getting us to that point. And one is that we have to be very clear and articulate and just take stock of where we are at. And, you know, we are coming from a context where whenever you have these momentous occasions, people want to focus so much on the wins or the advances that we've been able to make. And sometimes we tend to hyperbolize what that looks like. For example, we're celebrating that girls are getting educated, and yet if you look at transition rates, they tell a different story. We are celebrating that, you know, now we have laws and policies in place to address gender-based violence, but when you go to the ground, there's lack of implementation in some cases, there's resistance in some cases. So first and foremost, being really honest with ourselves with, this is a progress that we have made, but these are the challenges that still need to be addressed. And then over and above that is creating really inclusive processes. You know, and I love that Lusungu at the beginning mentioned that, you know, we're not homogeneous, we're not all the same. And so an experience of, as a young African woman living in Nairobi, from a middle class context is very different from a young African woman living in even as far as the villages of Kenya. And that's very different from young women in Zimbabwe. So making sure that we create spaces where we get to hear about the different contexts and the different challenges and how they manifest in those spaces. And then the other thing is to make sure that then we make sure that we're very specific in how we make those investments. I think the thing that I love about generation equality is we are moving from nice fluffy statements to getting people to say, to put their money where their mouth is. So asking governments to actually allocate resources. You say you want to fight GBV, put resources towards putting the systems and structures in place. So I think that would be a really critical thing. And it's all the way from the grassroots up. You know, if we're saying that we want more inclusive education, are we engaging different stakeholders on what that looks like and listening to voices and then building an education system that is responsive? And the last thing I want to say is we have to get to a point where we are removing those long-standing barriers. I think from the time I entered into the movement, we've been talking about barriers to women's access, barriers to women's leadership, barriers to education. It's time now to actually remove those barriers. So it's saying to policymakers, we want you to do X, Y, Z. We want actual frameworks. We don't just want policies sitting in governments. We want frameworks that actually tell us, from January 2022 to January 2026, this is what the framework or the road to creating change actually looks like. So for me, that's a critical thing, is to make sure that we are listening to voices, we are amplifying voices, we are getting people to represent themselves, not assuming that only specific people can represent certain voices. So making sure that we actually, if we're saying we're creating inclusive spaces, let them actually be inclusive. And I guess that's one of the advantages of COVID, is that now we've been able to open up, but not really. So it's looking at how can we make sure that these conversations that we're having online then cascade to the adolescent girl in an informal settlement or in a rural village somewhere in Kenya, to make sure that their voices are actually heard. The last thing I will say is this process needs to be iterative. It's brilliant that we have a manifesto that was put together and listened to the voices of 15,000 girls and young women, but that's just a very small fraction of African girls and young women on this continent. So also making sure that we have a very iterative process, maybe several review processes where we go back, consult, change, and not being afraid of changing language, of changing commitments, because that's the only way that we will get to where we want to go.
Thank you, Joy. No, you hit the nail on the head, absolutely. And I think the digital divide is real, and we must recognize it. And it's something that everyone must take into consideration, because online campaigning and online mobilization is not inclusive. There are so many women who do not have access to these resources. And I think what you said about recognizing one's privilege is such an important one. And it's something that came up last week with a conversation with the Pan-African activist Mahajwini about how a lot of feminist movements are often led by upper class women whose ways of perhaps trying to implement reforms is not intersectional enough. And this is something that we must stand against and really push against. And yes, we do want clear metrics and clear roadmaps. And I think there's a comment by Maureen here that I want to say, which is, we have policies and constitutions that are gathering dust in the shelves of the government offices, and we need them implemented. So really making sure that our respective countries and governments are following up and not being afraid of change. I think a lot of people are afraid of changing that sentence in the constitution or in shifting things, but we need it, because otherwise, so far it's been marginalizing a lot of young women, and it's been pushing us to the periphery, and that's not helping anyone, and it's purely amplifying the oppressive structures that exist. So Lusungu, on that same vein, we have emphasized as the NALA Feminist Collective that we stand against marginality because young women have been left out of these national conversations and spaces. And I think it's time to say enough is enough to that marginality. However, policy spaces, both that are international and local, still have a lot of gatekeepers. And when we say that generation equality cannot move forward without Africa, it is to say that we're against, the tokenization, which you've mentioned, that young women face. We're against the tokenization of young women's voices and also performativity. And I wanted to pick your brain a bit more on this particular point. I would love to hear if you have more thoughts on this.
Sure, sure. And I just wanted to first add on what you said about a conversation on feminist movements being led by elitist women, you know, upper class. Yeah, but I just wanted to add another more nuanced aspect to that, is that who is being listened to. So, because for me, I have had the privilege of working with grassroots women's rights organizations, and these women are feministing. They are doing work on the ground, changing. They're not on social media, they're not, but they are leaders in their communities. They are doing the work, right? But then they do not have access to internet to tweet a picture of how they mobilized over 50 women, for example, to stop a child marriage, or they do not have Facebook to share a post on how they fought for justice for a lady whose land was grabbed, you know. So there is work that is happening at the community level, but it's like, who are we listening to, and who is being platformed and who is not being platformed? So I feel like it's very important that we also take that conversation there, and that we are deliberate in ensuring that when we come to such conversations, we are asking who is not here, why are they not here, whose voice are we not hearing, and why are we not hearing it? And on the fear of change, I totally agree, because I think it's an issue of, you know, power. It all boils down to power in the patriarchy, and the patriarchy loves power, because let's tell it as it is here. If we are going to be empowered, although sometimes I get uncomfortable with that word, it means someone has to concede power. And those who in power do not want to concede power, right? But the conceding of this power does not mean it will make life worse for them. No, it just means society will be less freer and more equal. So there is that issue too that I think we constantly have to be challenging. Now, on the issue of gatekeepers and tokenism, I don't know any young woman who has never been used as a token, first of all. And I have sat in a lot of meetings where I'm like, okay, why did I come? What am I doing here? Where you don't even get in a word. And even in the feminist movement itself, where we talk about the intergenerational gap, where we're saying women, young women, when we come into these spaces, we're not given the opportunity to speak, right? But then for me, I believe if we continue, as I mentioned at the beginning, if we continue to ensure that we resist individualism in our struggle, make sure that it's still about the collective. I know of scholars like, Jessica Horn, Sylvia Tamali, even Stella Nyazi, and then you've got the Angela Davises that have shown us that it's about the collective, which is why I said it at the beginning. If you remember, I said resist the quickness at which governments, donors, big agencies want to select one of us and put us on a pedestal. Because what that does is silence us. But if we stay together in a collective and say, no, we are here, we are working together, we've got our differences, these are our different needs, for example, as we have done, as the Manifesto has done. And of course, I agree with Joy that it has to be an active and living document that is open to change, and we are adapting as issues emerge. And then as we are also listening, that whose voice is missing in here. So for me, I have found that ensuring that we're still working as a collective and resisting the urge for individualism in the movement and in our spaces where we're making a difference has been very important in resisting tokenism. But also, no, being able to say no. When you see it, call it out and say no. You are being invited to be part of a big thing. And you're like, okay, how many young women are coming? Oh, it's just you, because you're doing great work. No, I know that at any given point, there's a younger woman working harder than me, doing it better than me. And I know that we are stronger together than just bringing me in that room. So make sure that even when you find yourself in such a room, leave the door open, and don't just leave the door open. It should not end there. Make sure that you are calling them out, you are pointing to other young women that this is the way and this is how we have to go. If that is not possible, then make sure that you know so well, we know so well the struggles that are happening in our communities, all these demands that are put there, that we are able to represent them well, right? When we are given those spaces. And lastly, what I wanted to say is we should not underestimate our ability of creating our own spaces, to the point that at any given point, we should always remember we are stronger than than any kind of power, right? We are stronger than that. So if we build a critical mass, let them come to us and talk to us. And as Joy said, let them talk by opening their press. We know what we want. We know what has to happen. Don't come to tell us. Come and say, here's the press. Do what you want to do. And for me, I feel like that will continue to slowly eat away at this disease, because it is a disease, this tokenism that happens. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lusungu. And I can't agree more. I think it's so hard to remain as a collective, but at the same time, it is so important to resist that individualism. And I think what you said reminds me of how a lot of African feminist movements are being co-opted by international organizations. And it just really made me remember Audre Lorde's Marxism, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, how we should consider what the master's house and what those tools are, and that actually radical change must happen by making new tools and not necessarily sort of minor adjustments to dominant systems. And so what I wanted to also just go back a little bit and speak about what the Nala Feminist Collective is trying to do, because I think the aim and the mission is to foster and mobilize young women and bring them into those spaces, bridging between grassroots spaces and policy, because there's a huge gap and we are not heard. We are non-existent in those spaces. And even sometimes when you end up there, you're not necessarily seen as a grassroots, you're immediately considered as a policymaker or as an innovator within that space, which isn't the case. So I think what's great about NALA is its council. The council has now 17 feminist leaders from across the continent and the diaspora. Some are policymakers, some are activists, some are women in the arts. We have Vanessa Nakate, who's the Ugandan climate activist. There's Jahadu Kure from the Gambia, who's an FGM activist. There is the Minister of Women and Gender of Ethiopia, Her Excellency Filsan Abdullahi. There's also Mrs. Bogolo Kenewendo, the former Minister of Trade and Industry of the Republic of Botswana, among other powerful feminists. So I think there's an exciting road in front of us, especially as we move towards the Generation Equality Forum in Paris next month. And if you're interested in what we're going to do there, please, to everyone watching us here on the webinar or on the Facebook Live, make sure to follow our updates on our socials and social media. This made me want to ask Joy a question, and I think it's really important to think about what certain words mean to us as feminist activists, as Pan-African women who want to see change. So Joy, I would really love it if you could tell me what comes to mind when you hear the word equity and impact.
When I saw that question, I had to do research sort of to remind myself what it actually means, because sometimes, as you say, words have meaning, but when you're in these spaces for too long, the meaning sort of kind of waters down. And the conclusion I got to is that equity really appreciates that we are all not in having the same experiences, and we also face very different barriers in our lives. And so equity is really about acknowledging that there are those, we orient really differently, and creating a level playing field that acknowledges those different challenges. So when I think of equity, I think of fairness. When I think of equity, I think of, justice, and ensuring that justice is measurable to the violation at hand, particularly when I think of GBV. When I think of equity, I think of, impartiality and the inclusivity and meaningful inclusivity. And I really love the conversation that you just had with Lusungu, because it's not about saying that, oh, we're going to create this new space and we're going to bring everybody along, but you're not really bringing everybody along. Say, if you're going to have a meeting that isn't looking at it being accessible for persons living with disability, for example, or acknowledging that because of certain orientations, some people might not feel safe to contribute to certain conversations because it might come at a risk to their well-being and their safety. So it's about really reevaluating what we mean by access and reevaluating what we mean by creating equitable spaces, to appreciate that people orient really differently. And then on the question of impact, it brought me back to, what we were saying at the top of the call, is that it has to be tangible. Like we have to feel it. We have to feel the results. If we're saying we're going to ensure that girls and young women are able to enjoy their rights, they need to be able to feel it by knowing that they can go to a school and they won't be discriminated because they, for example, have come to school and they're pregnant, and so there are policies that are not going to send them away from school. It's ensuring that it's tangible, that you can feel the payoff, that we stop referring to people as women leaders or female leaders or young leaders, and just acknowledge that you're a leader, and that's it. You don't need an identifier or a qualifier for that. It's knowing that Lusungu is coming in this space with certain experiences and certain expertise, and acknowledging her for that, and not having to add an identifier to, she's a young leader from Africa, so removing that. And that change has to be also progressive, that we can't come back to this conversation 10 years from now and still be talking about tokenism, and still be talking about exclusion, and still be talking about, the challenges. In fact, I remember last year when we held a conversation around Beijing, it was heartening and disheartening, because it was heartening because, we were seeing young women on the ground actively creating change, actively addressing challenges. But then it was disheartening because we realized these are the same things that our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers were, same challenges that they were addressing. So for me, impact would be, when I look back 10 years from now, I can actually count and say that we came from here and now we are here and we are making this progress. So can I feel it? Can I walk in the streets and not be afraid that as a young woman walking in Nairobi, I could be violated because someone feels entitled to my body, for example? So that's equity and impact for me, is real change that is fair, that is tangible, that is something that we can experience.
Thank you so much, Joy. Lusungu, would you like to add, or would you like to share with us what you think about those two words as well?
Oh, wow. So I really think Joy has covered it really well. Yeah, I think the only thing that I would want to add, which is very short, is, for me, when I think about equity, I also think about restorative justice. So it's about also looking at historical context, like what has happened. Here, I know that there's this controversial let me not call it controversial, because it's only controversial when men are talking about it, the issue of affirmative action, right? How it is translated as, oh no, then it means you're not in because of merit. It's just because you're a woman. But no, it's acknowledging the historical oppression and how you are years behind, how, for example, we are years behind men in terms of equal pay, in terms of, policies that are women friendly in the workplace, and looking at all those aspects, but also focusing on the intersectionality of it all, right? That we don't face the same oppression. For example, I'm Lusungu. I know that I have certain privileges that another woman does not have. For example, a woman with a physical disability, a woman who belongs to the LGBTQ community might not have the same, because I have to think of safety, but not in the same way that they have to think about safety. So recognizing all that, and when we're talking about equity, including all those factors into play and making sure that we are, we are ensuring that we are making things right that were wrong. And I think on this as well, I'll bring up a conversation that I like to bring just briefly to say, when I see equity, I also think about the new buzzwords that keep coming in terms of the feminist spaces. And one of the most recent one that refuses to go away is male involvement. And when we talk about equity, we need to involve men, we cannot do it without men, but it's acknowledging that yes, men have to be involved but from what angle? An angle of accountability and responsibility, and not absorption of of oppression, but also recognizing the privilege that they bring and ensuring that we are not pedestaling them by according them all these different names we do, champions, whatever else that we do. And when they come into these spaces, ensuring that the person who is most affected is the one who continues to be centered in the issue that we're dealing with. For me, that is equity. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think that was what I heard. For me, was more of a roadmap on how everyone who's listening to this conversation can apply and can begin moving forward with. And the other point that I also wanted to share with you is when we talk about Beijing Plus 25, generation equality, this is a jargon that a lot of young women on the ground don't know anything about. And so it's very hard to even begin that conversation, because it's so far away from our realities, from what we go through. And I think the biggest challenge is how to not to make sure that young women in the African continent know about this, but to rather tell the policymakers and people sitting there that a lot of people don't know about what you're doing, and your policies are not affecting them because you don't know about their context and you don't know what they go through. And I think, Lusungu, what you said about the role of social media and amplifying the performativity sometimes of feminist actions is also so important to constantly think about. Just because I don't post about the actions that I do or the way I am feminist in doesn't mean that I'm out of the conversation. And there's a lot of cancel culture happening just because of that. And I think it's time to change that as well. There's a question in the chat which I would love for you to respond to. It's from an anonymous attendee, and it reads as follows: in my training for conflict in Sudan, I am sure to add gender equality plus role gender balance. In your experience, could you please share how to advocate more for this within the work? Joy or Lusungu, feel free to.
I'm happy for Joy to take that one. I do not have a lot of experience in the humanitarian context, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm same as Lusungu. I don't have much experience in conflict and humanitarian context, but I do know that one strategy that has worked, even in the African context, is leveraging mentorship as a tool for I don't want to say empowerment, but I think as a tool for passing on knowledge and getting people to interrogate and journey and question the way things are. And particularly, I think mentorship is quite a beautiful tool to use in even questioning gender roles and the history and where that is coming from. And it allows you to tap into people of different experiences, different people of different expertise. So I would just, say to the anonymous attendee is to look within their network, within their circle of influence, and look up to people who are able to bring these experiences and then take them to whichever groups that they are working with. And it, because of the way mentorship is structured, it's structured around conversation, it's structured around exchanges of experiences. It also creates that safe space, creates a safe space to have some very difficult conversations, and then create a support system for people to be able to sort of tap into. So that's what I know from my little knowledge around that.
Thank you so much for that thorough and generous answer. There's another question, which I think we might have touched upon, but if you could respond again in a shorter way, how do we ensure that the changes we're asking for are effective?
I'll quickly go back to the conversation you had with Lusungu as well. And it's around first and foremost, making sure that we take these conversations from the very high level spaces to the grassroots. I remember, again, I think it was last year, I was privileged to sit next to a lady who had actually participated in the Beijing 95 conference. And she said for her, the reason why there was so much momentum around it is because those who are privileged to be in those spaces made a commitment to take them to wherever their spheres of influence are. And that allows for cascade, and then it builds a movement around accountability. Because then it means that as people are making these commitments, say the Kenya government, for example, the Kenya government has made a commitment to eliminate FGM by 2020. Then it means that it needs to stop being here in a Nairobi conversation and start cascading to the villages of Nairobi, to the places where FGM is actually undertaken, so that the girls there can actually speak for themselves, and then the community around them can stand by them. And that's the only way that the change can happen. So making sure that these conversations, we make a commitment to carry them to the grassroots, and also just make a commitment to educate. One of the things that I realized as I was journeying in learning and unlearning a lot in my feminist journey is that there are so many things that we are taught and are ingrained, and you have to unlearn. And then sometimes I think we become, a bit entitled and feel like, oh, I have all this education, I'm feminist, I have, all this analysis, and forgetting that there's someone out there who doesn't have that analysis because they haven't been privileged to be in spaces where they have people who can support them to journey, to teach them to unlearn, so they can begin to use their voices and actually speak out against certain things. So I think for them to be sustainable, we have to make a commitment to educate those within our immediate spheres of influence, so that it becomes sort of like an amoeba that is just going around and co-opting and bringing people along, and bringing people who wouldn't necessarily be part of the movement to be part of the movement. And that's why I, in seeing what Nala is trying to do and the essence around it, that's the feeling that I get. It's about cascading and making sure that there are a lot more people who are calling for accountability, other than a few people within civil society or within specific movements.
Thank you so much, Joy. I hope anyone listening can make it a commitment to themselves to just go back and digest and re-listen to what you and Lusungu have said, because I think it's really important to not only be kind to ourselves in the process of unlearning, but also understand how do we go about it, so that we're not sort of going through violent processes within that unlearning, and knowing how to go about it in ways that will not prevent us from still showing up for our sisters in feminist spaces. There's another question, which is, how best can collective voices be represented in the spaces to avoid individualism?
That's a very good question. For me, in terms of how best we can, because of course all of us, like I don't know how many young women we are on the continent. We cannot all fit in the UN building. If we would still need to focus on, having people who are representing us, right? But for me, it's leadership, horizontal leadership at different levels, right? So it's not just about saying, oh, this is our leader and this is the one that, that will do all the representations. But all of us, we have ownership and we understand the vision and the change that we are trying to do. Once we understand that, I believe that in different spaces, for example, what Amina can best say to, for example, a big agency like the UN, if you're going to talk to the UN, and what I can say to the AU, and what someone will say to the Malawi government, and what Joy will say to the Kenyan government is the same. We all understand, we carry the same message and we are saying the same message, right? But also ensuring that we are not working in silos and we are able to be as transparent and accountable. Accountable is very important. For example, for me, as we talked about the issue of privilege, I recognize my positionality, right? To, for example, because of the way society is structured, if I go the way I am, for example, to a rural part of Malawi, they will already, and I'm talking to, for example, someone who is my own age, I'm 32, in a rural part of Malawi, who has not gone to school, for example. The first assumption might be that I have the power dynamics there are a bit different. But for example, what gives me the right, other than her, to represent her needs at any level? So it's ensuring that we are all in consensus together, that yes, we have listened to every voice, and we are not playing favorites, I can use that word, because even at the continental level, in the feminist movement, in the women's movement, it is there. We are not playing, we are not being performative. We are not measuring our issues based on, oh, she's the one who's very educated, she's the one who's this, she's the one who's this. But no, looking at our issues. And what I have learned is that the health status of any movement or any country, you can gauge it based on how they treat those who are the most marginalized. If you think about it, who is the most marginalized in that group? How are they treated? Is their voice heard? If not, then we're doing the representation wrong. And our job should be really to pass on the mic. I remember when, as Joy was talking about bringing in, talking about her feminism and her journey of unlearning. When I came into, in my as I was getting into my 20s, I remember declaring when I was coming out of university, I was like, I'm gonna be the voice for the voiceless. I'm gonna be the voice for the voiceless. But really, who taught me that they don't have a voice? Who told me they don't have a voice and that people out there, it's just who is listening and do they have a platform? So right now, I have realized my role, that in other instances, I'm the person who someone needs to pass the mic to. And in other instances, I'm the one who should pass on the mic, create a platform and pass on the mic to people who can, who can best represent the issues that we're talking about. Yeah.
Amina, can I quickly jump in as well? As Lusungu was speaking, I was, dancing inside because everything she said is exactly what I was thinking. But I'd just like to add two things. And one is about acknowledging that even when there are times when you have to be the person who's in that room, is to attribute and acknowledge that you're not the only generator of the information or knowledge. And that speaks to bringing visibility to certain things. Again, in my own experience is that some certain spaces are so exclusive that understanding how to navigate them then becomes difficult. So then we have to also make a commitment to ensure that we rethink what access means. And yes, apart from acknowledging that, yeah, I am not the only person who needs to be in that room all the time, but if I'm going to bring along another young woman, is think about, is there a language barrier? How can we mitigate that barrier? Making sure that, for example, there's a translator in place or whatever, is saying to them that, you know what, UN processes are not maybe straightforward to navigate. So this is how you navigate this space so that then they can effectively engage in those spaces. Is deliberately avoiding this culture of silencing and being the voice of the voiceless. Like that notion needs to change. And that's one of the things that we need to disrupt. So that then if certain people are saying, oh, this person can't be in this room because they don't have formal education, is acknowledging that they might not have formal education, but they have a lot more experience that they're bringing to the room. And this is why I'm vouching for so-and-so who is better placed to speak on these issues than me. So for example, I can't speak for grassroots young women. I can't speak for young women with disabilities. I can't speak for young women living with HIV and AIDS. Like those are not my experiences. I might have heard of them. I might be educated on them, but I'm not the best person to represent them. And just knowing, I guess it's almost getting to a space where we can hold ourselves accountable to know that there are certain spaces that you're not the best representative to be there. And as much as it's bringing you spotlight and all of that, is you just need to open the door for someone else. So I just wanted to restate that.
Thank you. I think it's so important to say it out loud. And I was also nodding because I was like, yes, African women have voices, but they're being silenced. We need to create more spaces for them to be included. And absolutely, in education, a certificate from an educational institution is not equivalent to lives of experiences. And I think it's also important to acknowledge, to constantly invite people to acknowledge their positionalities and to really think about it, because sometimes, a lot of people don't, and it's very violent to the other people who come with humility to join those spaces, only to find that the doors are being locked. There's a question here about what is unique about Nala Femme from other similar movements, and how do you see change in the next 5 years? I think this is an important question, Melvin. Thank you for asking it. What's unique about Nala Femme? I think the most interesting thing is that the mission and vision of Nala is to take women's voices and demands and present them at international levels, and to continue bringing African women together to speak about which change they would like to see. So the change that we would like to see is the change that African women are demanding. And this is economic justice, digital justice, criminalizing gender-based violence, creating spaces for more intergenerational co-leadership, and other demands, paid work, and the introduction of more legislations that do not oppress women, access to justice and equal rights. So I would invite you to have a read at the manifesto and to to get an understanding of those demands, but to also tell us what are your demands if they do not fall under any of those, under any of those 10 demands. The time is running, and I just wanted to thank you, Joy and Lusungu, for your generosity and kindness. And I feel like this was more of a mentorship session than anything. And I hope a lot of people took notes and would still go back to this recording to listen to you again, because I think it's really important to inform and to educate in ways that do not include a cancel culture that would want an African woman to withdraw herself from the space. I know there was a lot of conversations happening in the chat, and there were a lot of comments, and we didn't have time to read through all of them, but there's a final comment that I will read, which is from Jahu, how the conversation links back to the idea of resisting individualism and pushing back on the monolithic ideation of an African woman. It's eerie how universal some of these experiences are. Thank you, Lusungu and Joy. So thank you everyone for joining us. This has been a delight. Please, this is not the end of the conversation, it's only the beginning. And at NALA, we aim to host weekly Wednesday webinars with other incredible powerhouses from the African continent. And we warmly invite you to keep being updated via our social media channels. I've shared them on the chat, so I hope you can check those out. Yeah, I have so much gratitude, and I feel like I've grown a lot in the past hour. Thank you so much, Joy and Lusungu, and I hope to host you soon on another topic. But thank you so much for what you're doing in your communities as well, and for the mentorship that you've provided us with today.
Thank you so much for having me. And Joy, you are now my sister, whether you...
Definitely.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. It's been, I really enjoyed it, and thank you, Amina, for your thought-provoking questions. Yeah, they were quite insightful, and I look forward to continuing these conversations on online platforms.
Yeah, very challenging questions, kept us on our toes.
Thank you so much. I have one last ask for everyone who's joined this conversation. If the demands of the manifesto speak to you, please do share them with your mother, with your aunt. Read the manifesto, explain it to them. They don't have to read it per se, because this is not an academic text. This can be easily understood, and they would relate to it. And you can sign the manifesto and join your voices to thousands of other African young women, and let's do this together. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.